Welcome to the video lecture series, Culture, Worldview, and Origins. We're Tim and Holly Nyquist. This lecture is the 6th out of 7 together, and it builds off of the previous lectures. Don't have time to really review all the previous lectures, but there are components that are necessary to remember. What we're looking at today is, number 16, relation of reason to faith. And this relationship that we're looking at is built off of other thinking blocks that have already been established or already set. And they are the different domains, the natural, supernatural, the domain of, or the separation of matter and spirit, the separation of secular, sacred, and this continues that thought pattern. So it's kind of a package deal that we as Westerners, that we seem to have adopted or been cultivated in thinking this way. So what is the relationship of reason to faith according to a Western tendency? This one is a little complicated. I'm not trying to expand on or get to the bottom of a debate that's been going for centuries about the relationship of reason to faith. And so I'm not in this series trying to get into depth of what the Western side is. What I'm trying to do is just compare the two sides, and that they are different on the relationship of different concepts. So on this side of relationship of reason to faith and the Western tendency, we have faith equals belief, and then there's a separation. It's almost like there are two different domains, and below that is reason is equal to logic. And what often happens in this area of thinking with myself and with others is that we follow the two separate domains of thinking, where faith then corresponds to supernatural, faith then corresponds to the spirit world, and faith corresponds to sacred. All those divisions. Whereas then reason corresponds to the natural world, and reason corresponds to the matter, and reason corresponds to the secular world. And so we already have the divisions, and so how do we relate then the terms, since in our minds we've already created much of a division? There's been 4 different ways that they've tried to look at the categories of faith and reason through the Western concept. And one is just the conflict model, is called. And what that means is that they each are equally valid ways of getting to truth. And therefore, if there's a difference between the truth of faith and the truth of reason, then there's conflict, there's debate, and there's one trying to impose the truth of their concept over the concept of the other. And so that is the conflict. Then the second one is called the incompatibility model, which means that you can't put them on the same line. You can't put them in the same conversation. They are incompatible. They are of two different aims, two different methods, and so reason aims at empirical truth, while faith aims at doctrinal truth or religious truth, and so that they can't converse with each other because they're from two different worlds, two different domains. The next one would be what's called the weak compatibility model, which also could be the compromise model somewhat, in that there can be dialogue, but the dialogue can only go so far, because if faith maintains miracles, then that is kind of the cutoff point between reason, because reason maintains the scientific method. And so you can have dialogue between the two. There's a weak compatibility, but there must be then compromise to bring them together at all. Then there's the fourth model, or the fourth model would be the strong compatibility model, or the strong compromise model, which would mean that we can get to God and we can get to faith through reason. And so that would be a natural philosophy, or a natural theology. And so that would mean that we don't get to God or reliable knowledge through revelation. We get it through human reasoning and through logic. And so basically what these two terms come out to be is kind of a tug-of-war between authority. And where is that locus of authority, of which we also talked about earlier? The locus of authority, Western-wise, is internal. And so we have that authority within us. And so this kind of exposes that who has the authority. Is it internal in me? And so I go with human reason and logic, and therefore the truth comes out of me? Or is it in faith, in belief, in an external source of authority, which would be revelation? So that is what the tension here in this Western side is between what is the interface between faith and reason. And so those are the four models. On this side of the Western tendency, we don't have that tension. We don't have the tension. The locus of authority is external. There is a submission to that external authority. And so in the non-Western tendency is to have a faith that is reasonable because it's in obedience to what their faith is based on. So if it's revelation, then they are faithful to that revelation, and so their faith is reasonable because it is based on a previous revelation or previous history. And so their faith could be very reasonable because it's historical documents. That is what they read, that's what they focus on, and so their faith is reasonable. Now, it doesn't mean human reason, it means reason based on that external source of knowledge, the external source of authority, that external source. And so that goes back to the beginning of that there is no division or separation between creator and created. There's no separation between the spirit and the matter. There's no separation between the sacred and the secular. And here there is no separation between faith and reason. It's reasonable. Their faith is a reasonable faith that is put into action. So that is the two ways of looking at reason and faith and how they relate to each other culturally from the Western or non-Western way of looking at. Next we go to number 17, categories of reference. Categories of reference. On the Western front, we have the Western tendency is to categorize them as fictional, as our references, our source of references, our reading material is fictional or non-fictional. And non-fictional, under non-fictional, you can have mythological. And what that means is that their source, our source, my source, is non-fictional or fictional. Fictional means imaginary. Means that it is not based on history. It is something imagined. And so a fictional source of reference material or of teaching material is something that did not happen in history, but it could look like history. It could have happened maybe somewhere, and it's, well, either that or it might be so far fictional that it doesn't correspond to history either. It corresponds to future events that have never been seen before as science fiction. And and then non-fictional. Non-fictional just means that it's not fiction, which is interesting to see the categories, because what that means is that fictional then is the center post of our reference material, and if it is true, then it's non-fictional. It's kind of like my division of Western and non-Western. I start with the Western as my center point because I am Western and in my thinking processes, and then I go to the other thinking point, which would be non-Western, non-me. So this is an interesting concept in that our starting point for reference material is fictional. It is imaginary. It is internal. It is with the locus of authority. It is with the auditory processing. It is internal. So this side, where do we have it? Non-Western. And they are very historical based. The reference materials refer to historically known events. I want to share just one thing of what I had read in my research. There was a researcher in Russia many years ago that was researching the rural communities before the Western school system came in to the areas, and it was A.R. Luria, and he wrote a book, Cognitive Development and Its Cultural Social Foundations. And he was testing and making different tests of the rural people, and he wanted to see how they would respond. And so he had this one test that he was applying, saying, okay, he said, imagine that you are going to the city or to another town that is 40 miles away from here. Now, how long would it take you if you rode a bicycle to get there and you rode at 5 miles an hour? Well, often the response was, you can't ride a bicycle there. The roads are too rough. It's too high. It's too this, it's that. And he says, you can't do that. And so then the researcher, Luria, came back and said, okay, well, just imagine that you could. And they said, no, you can't. You can't do that. And so it was a fascinating insight in that this rural community that he was trying to get data from could not imagine it or would not imagine it because it was not done. It was not done before historically, so therefore it could not be commented on, or they could not put themselves in that position because it was not able to be done. And whereas this side, based on fiction or non-fiction, and fiction is imaginary, it's imaginative, and imaginative is based on an internal processing that's separated from any context, any experience. And so we are able to generate imaginary contexts or imaginary situations without having to experience it, because our locus of authority is internal and our thinking is internal and our locus of authority is internal, and so we can think that way, whereas our other friends, they have a very hard time even processing that or being able to think, how can I put myself in an imaginary situation? They resist. They cannot or do not do it. Categories of reference. Interesting. Okay. Number 18. Expression of faith. How do I express my faith? And what we're going to see in the rest of the series is that we all possess a faith in something. So faith means, how do we express it? How do we express what we believe? What would be the Western tendency? What would be my way of expressing my personal faith? Well, coming from our reference point of fictional or non-fictional, and we're looking at reason and logic as a base of our thinking process, and even as a base of our faith. We have reason and logic as the base of it, and I come from a literate society, which means literature, which means we put a lot of trust in literature, in books, in paper, in writings, in contracts, in what's on paper. So our expression of faith in the Western tendency is through creeds and doctrines. So when we're looking for a place to worship, we will often study their doctrinal position and to see if we are in agreement. Then after us being in agreement and we want to become a member of that body, then they will give me a doctrinal assessment as to if I am compatible or not with that group of people. And so creeds and doctrines and written documents are very important as a part of this side of our expression of our faith. On this side, not to say that they're not literate, but literature is not a foundation of their society. So books are not that important. Doctrine is not that important. What we have here is what is important are deeds and actions. So their faith is lived out. Their faith is by watching. And so if I wanted to become a part of some group over here, they wouldn't have a statement of faith. They probably wouldn't have doctrines or creeds that I would need to sign on with. They would probably say, let me watch. Let us watch you. Let us watch you in action, and to see if your actions reflect what we value. And so on this side, the expression of faith, the non-Western tendency, is through deeds and actions, not necessarily through what you might call creeds and doctrines. Again, there's something I would like to mention a little bit that I dug up about history. I'm not going to mention any facts about it because I'm not clear. I haven't read it for a while, so I don't want to say names or dates or places because I might mess up on something. But what was the conquest of South America and of the Inca Empire, which is Bolivia and Peru area. And that was kind of where the last concentration. And the last reigning Inca was captured and brought to the Spanish leaders. And the Spaniards, from what I've heard, gave him, the Inca leader, an opportunity to join them and to become a Christian. And so they held out a book, the Bible, and they said, this is the Word of God. This is what we follow. Will you bow your knee to this authority, to this Word of God, of whom we are messengers of? And the Inca ruler said, that's the Word of God. And they said, yes. And so he said, may I? And they handed it to him. So he took it and put it up to his ear. He didn't hear anything. And he held it out and then dropped it and said, that is dead. I will not worship a dead God. And there became the massacre. And that's what started. So it was kind of a expression of faith. For us, we don't need to really see much life. We just agree with intellectually, creeds and doctrines, where this side wants to see life. This side wants to see deeds and actions. And anyway, just an interesting difference between the two. The expression of our faith, creeds and deeds, actions. That is 16, 17, and 18. Those are the 3 points in this part of the lecture series. We're Tim and Holly Nyquist. If you have questions or comments, you'd like to contact us, you can do it through doubleroadrover.com. That's the blog spot. Or you can contact us directly through email at thn.academia@gmail.com. Again, thanks for joining me, and hope to see you in the next one.